Hey guys, with Phase 4 coming out, we've had a lot of talk about the Marvel Cinematic Multiverse. The multiverse has come up in Spider-Man No Way Home, Loki, Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness, and it's even been hinted at in Hawkeye when Hawkeye introduces the character Kingpin, who's first introduced to us in the Marvel television shows, kind of finally confirming that those shows are in fact canon. And with Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield appearing in Spider-Man No Way Home, it really makes us need to consider and think about how the Marvel Cinematic Multiverse actually works. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this episode of Constant Review. So, the Marvel Cinematic Multiverse. Let's break it down to where it came from inside of the MCU. So in the final episode of the show Loki, Loki is basically responsible for destroying the single sacred timeline. At the end of Loki, we see the timeline diverge into many different timelines, creating various variants and many different stories or versions of what-if possibilities across the multiverse. Now, a lot of people have asked the question about how logic of Loki actually works, because in episode 2, Loki points out that you can avoid creating branches in the timeline by hiding in apocalypses. A lot of people don't like that because they think it's kind of weird. When Loki goes back in episode 2 to the destruction of Pompeii, Loki warns them that the volcano is about to erupt. And a lot of people think that this would result in the bodies, for example, being in different locations than where they were discovered when the wreckage of Pompeii was eventually uncovered. However, we find out in passing in Loki that this isn't how it works. In fact, branches in the timeline don't occur when something in the timeline has changed. Instead, it happens when the timeline has branched significantly from where it originally was headed and starts moving in a different direction. That's why certain other timelines can exist without causing branches. For example, in episode 5, we're introduced to the character of Classic Loki. And Classic Loki had our Loki's exact life and timeline up until his death, where he instead pretends to be dead by creating an illusion of himself and instead hiding on a deserted planet.
I cast a projection of myself so real, even the mad Titan believed it, then hid as inanimate debris.
Now, because this deserted planet is never discovered and he never interacts with anyone, this causes him to not affect the timeline up until the point where he decides to try to leave that planet and meet his brother again. This act instead actually causes a branch in the timeline because it would change the destiny of those characters. So we can see how not every change in the universe actually creates a new timeline, only the significant ones that would branch reality. This is also visible in the show What If, where we notice that there are many different timelines shown in this show. However, just because they are different timelines doesn't mean that they're absolutely identical to the sacred timeline, or rather, the timeline we see in the MCU. For example, in the episode What If Killmonger Saves Tony Stark, in What If, you notice the dialogue is ever so slightly different than what happened in the actual MCU timeline. So it requires a significant change in order for the timeline to actually branch. Now, we don't know exactly what constitutes a significant change. For example, in some occasions, a very small instance can actually cause that change.
Maybe you started an uprising, or were just late for work. Whatever it was, stepping off your path created a Nexus event.
We see that in the first episode of What If, when Peggy Carter deciding to stay on the floor instead of going to the viewing booth is the small change that eventually erupts into her becoming Captain Carter. But more importantly, this also explains how He Who Remains is able to regulate the entire flow of time. We find out in episode 6 that He Who Remains is not a god, is not a superpowered being. He is just a man, admittedly a 31st century man with advanced technology, but still just a human from Earth. So how is He Who Remains able to understand and remember everything that happens in the entire history of the universe? Simple. He doesn't. He instead remembers a fundamental truth, which is that the universe has to unfold in a very specific way. For example, Tony Stark must become Iron Man. The Avengers have to assemble when attacked by Loki. And the Avengers need to defeat Thanos in the year 2023. These points and events are described by the Ancient One in What If Doctor Strange Loses His Heart. They're described as absolute points, and they're points where basically the time stream is focused around. And as long as these absolute points are maintained, the timeline will not branch.
Her death is an absolute point in time.
Absolute.
Unchangeable. Unmovable.
So then what does He Who Remains actually know about the flow of time? Well, he knows the main events, the main chronology of the universe, but he does seem to have specific information about one thing, and that is his own death. In episode 6 of Loki, we see that he has the actual transcript for his final interaction, the interaction he will have with Sylvie and Loki before he dies. And at first sight, we might think that this is an example of how powerful he is, that he somehow magically already knows this interaction. But the truth is, it's not magical at all, and it's very straightforward. We see the exact technology onto how he would have this transcript in episode 1 of the show. In episode 1, we see a machine that's transcribing everything that happens in the universe, and lets Loki know everything that he's saying as he's saying it. So then, how does He Who Remains have the information of this interaction before it's being said? Simple. It isn't the first time it's being said. In fact, what He Who Remains explains in his final expositional dialogue before Sylvie just shanks him is that this has all happened before. In fact, the entire universe, his entire timeline, is on a repetitive loop. Just like the architect scene in The Matrix, this is all part of the design. Eventually, Loki and Sylvie are going to become variants. They're going to attempt to take over TVA, and they're going to kill He Who Remains.
You plunge your blade in my chest, and an infinite amount of me start another multiversal war, and I just end up right back here anyways. Reincarnation, baby.
And so, the reason why He Who Remains actually has a transcript for everything that is about to happen is because this has all happened before, and he's just living through the days that he has himself, in a way, already lived through. So then what exactly did Renslayer get at the end of Loki, and where did she go? At the end of the show, we see that she gets a file, and I believe what's contained in this file is very straightforward. And it's very straightforward once you remember that He Who Remains himself is a variant. He Who Remains himself is not the original version of himself in the sacred timeline. He was created and occurred because he was born within a multiverse that branched out after many, many iterations and after a lot of war. And so currently, He Who Remains is not being born in the MCU. However, now that Loki and Sylvie have branched the timeline at the end of the show, there's once again going to be a branch, in which case He Who Remains will be born again. And in that timeline, he is going to talk to someone and have a life that has happened before, and because it has happened before, has already been recorded by the universe recording machine that we see in episode 1. So where did Renslayer go at the end of Loki? I believe that that file contains Renslayer and He Who Remains' first ever conversation. And because she now has this information, she is able to find out exactly which timeline our version of He Who Remains will be born in, and will be able to give him the information required to repair the TVA and restore the timeline.
Where are you gonna go?
In search of free will.
And so what does that mean for the Marvel Cinematic Multiverse as a whole? What does it mean to actually restore the sacred timeline and get rid of the multiverse? For a brief moment in time, we're going to see many different versions of Marvel properties interacting with each other. And all these Marvel properties will be more than just interacting with each other, but will be confronting each other and fighting. folding their realities into each other, on top of each other, until when the multiverse is finally resolved, we will be left with one timeline. A timeline where characters from every branch of the multiverse have come together and have settled upon. Meaning the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, Daredevil, the Netflix properties, all of them will fold down into the same timeline and exist concurrently within the MCU. Or at least that's what I think. So, guys, what do you think? Do you think that Renslayer is off to find young He Who Remains? I think that's pretty much a guarantee. But let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.